The morning of June 16th, 1943, 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, the sky is that particular shade of Pacific blue that seems to promise safety endless, clear, deceptive. Ensign Alexander Vraciu sits strapped into the cockpit of his Grumman F-6F Hellcat, hands trembling slightly on the control stick, not from fear but from something else entirely. Adrenaline, anticipation, the weight of a lie he's been carrying since the day he walked into that Navy recruitment office in Chicago. He's never fired his guns in combat, never seen an enemy aircraft except in grainy training films and recognition posters. And in approximately 4 minutes, he will begin a sequence of events that will last exactly 15 minutes and will fundamentally challenge everything the United States Navy believes about how to train fighter pilots. 7 Japanese aircraft will fall from the sky, 7 confirmed kills, 1 pilot, his first mission. But the story isn't really about the kills. It's about what those 15 minutes revealed, a truth so uncomfortable that the Navy would spend the next 2 years trying to reconcile it with their doctrine, their training programs, their entire philosophical approach to aerial warfare, because Alexander Vraciu shouldn't have been in that cockpit at all, and everything he was about to do violated nearly every tactical principle he'd been taught. This is a story about the moment when natural instinct collided with military doctrine, when exceptional ability revealed itself in a way that couldn't be explained, codified, or reproduced. And when one skinny kid from Indiana, who'd cheated his way into naval aviation, demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in war is exactly what you've been trained not to do. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened in those 15 minutes, you have to understand who Alexander Vraciu was, and more importantly, who the Navy thought he should be. 1941, East Chicago, Indiana, a steel town on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, where the air smells like iron and coal smoke, and where the children of immigrants work in the mills just like their fathers. Alexander Vraciu, called Alex by everyone who knew him, was the son of Romanian immigrants. His father worked at Youngstown Sheet and Tube. The family lived in a modest house in a neighborhood where ambition meant a steady job and a pension. Vraciu was small, 5 feet 8 inches, 145 pounds, with a quiet demeanor that made him easy to overlook. But he had 2 defining characteristics: an obsessive interest in aviation that bordered on pathological, and eyesight that was, by any honest assessment, inadequate for military flight duty. The eyesight problem was significant. The Navy's standards for pilot candidates in 1941 were unforgiving: 20/20 vision or better, no exceptions. The logic was sound: a fighter pilot needed to spot enemy aircraft at extreme distances, often just tiny specks against clouds or ocean. A pilot who couldn't see well enough was a liability to himself and his squadron. Vraciu's vision was approximately 20/30, correctable to 20/20 with glasses, not terrible for civilian life, disqualifying for naval aviation, so he cheated. The specifics of how he did it have been documented in his own later interviews. He went to the recruitment office early, when they were processing multiple candidates. He watched the candidates ahead of him take the eye exam. He memorized the chart. When his turn came, he recited the letters with perfect accuracy, squinting just enough to make it look difficult, but not enough to raise suspicion. The recruiter marked him as passed. It was a fraud. But it was also, in Vraciu's mind, necessary, because he understood something about himself that he couldn't articulate to a recruitment board. He was meant to fly. Not in the romantic sense, Vrasiu wasn't sentimental, but in the literal, neurological sense. His spatial awareness, his ability to think in 3 dimensions, his instinctive understanding of how objects moved through space, these weren't learned skills. They were innate. The Navy didn't test for that. They tested for vision. Naval aviation training in 1942 and 43 was an assembly line designed to produce a specific product: competent, survivable fighter pilots who could fly in formation, follow orders, and execute doctrine. The program was developed in response to a brutal mathematical reality. In 1942, the average combat lifespan of a Navy fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater was approximately 4 missions, not 4 months, 4 missions. The Japanese Zero fighter, flown by pilots who'd been in combat since the invasion of China in 1937, was superior to American fighters in nearly every performance category. It could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver the F-4F Wildcat. Japanese pilots had years of combat experience. American pilots had weeks of training. The Navy's response was to prioritize survival over aggression. The training doctrine emphasized defensive tactics, maintain formation integrity, never pursue alone, conserve ammunition, protect your wingman, break off engagement if separated. The philosophy was straightforward. A living pilot who achieves modest results is more valuable than a dead pilot who took risks. It was smart doctrine. It saved lives. And it was antithetical to everything that would make Alexander Vrasiu effective. Vrasiu went through the standard training pipeline: primary flight training at Naval Air Station Glenview in Illinois, where he learned basic flight skills; advanced training at Naval Air Station Miami, where he transitioned to the SNJ Texan trainer; operational training at Naval Air Station Melbourne, Florida, where he learned formation flying, gunnery, and carrier landing techniques. His instructors' evaluations were consistent: excellent technical skills, good situational awareness, and a tendency toward aggressive tactics. That last point appeared in multiple fitness reports. During training exercises, Vrasiu would break formation to pursue simulated targets. He'd dive below minimum safe altitude. He'd spend ammunition in long bursts instead of the prescribed short, controlled firing sequences. When confronted, he couldn't adequately explain his reasoning. He just saw opportunities that his instructors didn't. One instructor wrote in his evaluation, "Ensign Vrasiu demonstrates natural flying ability but lacks discipline. Recommend additional formation training before assignment to combat squadron." The Navy very nearly held him back from combat assignment, but they needed pilots desperately. In May of 1943, Vrasiu received orders to report to Fighting Squadron 6, VF-6, aboard the USS Intrepid. He was about to join one of the Navy's elite fighter squadrons, and he was completely unprepared for what combat would actually require. To understand VF-6, you need to understand the aircraft they flew and the tactical environment they operated in. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in January of 1943. It was the Navy's answer to the Japanese Zero, not through superior maneuverability, but through superior design philosophy. The Hellcat couldn't outturn a Zero, but it was faster in level flight and in a dive. It was more heavily armed, with 650 caliber machine guns compared to the Zero's 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, and critically, it was far more durable. The Hellcat had armor plate protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a structure that could absorb significant battle damage. The tactical doctrine for Hellcat pilots emphasized these advantages: engage from altitude, use speed and diving attacks, Never try to dogfight a zero in a turning engagement. The boom and zoom tactic: dive, fire, extend away using superior speed, climb back to altitude, repeat. It was effective. By mid-1943, the Hellcat was beginning to shift the air superiority balance in the Pacific, but it required discipline. Pilots who violated doctrine and tried to dogfight Zero still died regularly. VF-6 was based on the USS Intrepid, an Essex-class aircraft carrier that had been commissioned in August of 1942. The squadron had already seen combat in the Marshall Islands raids earlier in 1943. They'd lost pilots. They knew what combat looked like. When Vratsiu reported aboard in late May, he was replacing a pilot who'd been killed 2 weeks earlier over the Solomons. The squadron pilots assessed the new arrival with the cold calculation that combat units develop. Would he last long enough to be useful, or would he become a statistic? Vratsiu looked like a statistic. He was quiet, skinny, and had never been in combat. But there was one thing in his favor that his squadron mates didn't know about. He'd been training illegally. During his operational training in Florida, Vratsiu had convinced a veteran combat pilot, a man who'd flown in the Coral Sea and Midway, to take him up for unauthorized practice sessions. Not the scripted training exercises, real aggressive intercept drills, simulated dogfighting that violated safety regulations and training doctrine. This veteran pilot, whose name Vratsiu later declined to mention to protect him from potential repercussions, taught him something the Navy wouldn't. The manuals are written to keep average pilots alive. If you're better than average, the manuals will get you killed. You have to learn to trust your instincts. They practiced high-deflection shooting, firing at targets, crossing at extreme angles, where the lead calculation was intuitive rather than mathematical. They practiced vertical reversals, pulling into a climb and rolling over the top, a maneuver that could defeat a pursuing fighter but required precise energy management. They practiced one versus many scenarios, where the goal wasn't to defeat all opponents, but to create angles of attack against individual targets while avoiding the others. None of this was in the curriculum. All of it violated safety protocols, and all of it gave Vratsiu a set of instinctive responses that would activate under combat stress. June 16, 1943. The morning briefing aboard USS Intrepid. The intelligence officer laid out the situation. Japanese aircraft had been spotted heading toward American positions on Guadalcanal. Photographic reconnaissance suggested a strike package, probably dive bombers with fighter escort. VF-6 would launch 12 Hellcats to intercept. The tactical plan was standard. 6 two-plane elements in a loose formation at 18,000 feet. When contact was made, the elements would maintain integrity and engage using boom and zoom tactics. Wingmen would protect their element leaders. No one would pursue solo. If separated, return to the carrier immediately. Vratsiu was assigned as wingman to Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, the squadron's executive officer. Brewer was an experienced combat pilot with 3 confirmed kills. He gave Vratsiu the briefing that every new wingman received. Your job is to stay on my wing and protect my 6 o'clock. Don't chase kills. Don't get separated. If something goes wrong, head for home. Understand? Vratsiu understood. But as he walked to his Hellcat on the carrier deck, his hands were already shaking. Not from fear, the fear would come later, after the adrenaline wore off. This was pure anticipation. Every nerve in his body was alive. He felt like he could see everything: the deck crew's movements, the other pilot's body language, the wind direction from how the flag at the carrier's stern was moving. He climbed into his Hellcat aircraft number 13, which would later become his personal plane. The cockpit smelled like oil and hot metal. The 50 caliber machine guns in the wings each had 400 rounds. Total ammunition, 2,400 rounds. At the Hellcat's rate of fire, roughly 100 rounds per second across all 6 guns, that gave him 24 seconds of total firing time. The Navy trained pilots to fire in 1 to 2 second bursts, 10 to 12 firing opportunities. Use them wisely. Vrasiu would ignore that completely. The launch sequence was routine. 12 Hellcats catapulted off the Intrepid's deck in 4-minute intervals, forming up into 2 divisions of 6 aircraft each. Vrasiu took position on Brewer's right wing, approximately 100 feet away, and slightly aft, standard combat spread formation. They climbed to 18,000 feet and turned toward the intercept vector, the Solomon. Islands spread below them like green emeralds scattered across blue silk. Beautiful, if you weren't thinking about the men dying down there. Brewer's voice came over the radio. All elements, keep your eyes open. Bandits inbound from the northwest. Bandits was the call sign for enemy aircraft. The veteran pilots scanned the horizon methodically, using the technique they'd been taught. Divide the sky into sectors, scan each sector for 3 seconds, look for movement rather than shapes. Vrasiu saw them first. Lead, this is 2. Multiple contacts, 11 o'clock high, approximately 10 miles. Brewer looked where Vrasiu indicated. It took him 3 seconds to acquire the targets. Good eyes 2, I have them. Looks like Vals with 0 escort. Vals were Aichi D-3A dive bombers, the primary Japanese carrier-based bomber. Slow, vulnerable, but deadly if they reached their targets. The Zeros would be flying top cover, ready to bounce any American fighters that went after the bombers. Standard Japanese tactics. Standard American response. Engage the bombers while avoiding the fighters if possible. Brewer gave the order. All elements, prepare to engage, maintain formation, target the bombers first. The 12 Hellcats banked toward the enemy formation, and in that moment, Vrasiu's brain processed something that he couldn't have consciously explained. The Japanese formation was in a specific configuration, bombers, in a loose line abreast, Zeros stepped up and behind them. But there was a gap, a timing vulnerability. If the American fighters came straight in, the Zeros would have time to dive and intercept. But if someone hit the formation from a different angle, at a different timing, he didn't think it through. His hands were already moving. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He broke formation. Brewer's voice exploded in his headset. 2. Get. Back in position. Vrasiu, stay on my wing. But Vrasiu was already diving, rolling inverted, pulling his Hellcat through a maneuver that put him 30 degrees off the main attack axis. The G-forces pressed him into his seat. The airspeed indicator climbed through 300 knots. He was attacking alone, against doctrine, against orders, against everything he'd been taught. And he had a perfect position. The first Val never saw him coming. Vrasiu's approach angle put him in the bomber's blind spot below and to the right, climbing with excess speed from his dive. The Japanese rear gunner was scanning for threats from above and behind, where doctrine said American fighters would attack from. Vrasiu pulled lead, aiming not at where the bomber was, but where it would be in 1.4 seconds when his bullets arrived. His finger pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. The sound was overwhelming, even through his leather and helmet, a continuous tearing roar. Tracers arced across the sky in a converging stream. The Navy loaded one tracer round for every 5 ball rounds, so Vrasiu could see only 20% of his actual fire. The visible tracers looked like orange dashes connecting his Hellcat to the Val's engine cowling. The bomber's engine exploded in a spray of black smoke and burning oil. The Val nosed over, rolled inverted, and began its final spiral toward the ocean 18,000 feet below. Vrasiu didn't watch it fall. His eyes were already tracking the next target. The training said to fire in 1 to 2 second bursts, to verify the kill, to reacquire your formation and assess the tactical situation. Vrasiu had fired for 3 seconds. He didn't verify anything. And he was already moving. The second Val was in a slight bank, its pilot trying to maneuver away from the chaos that had suddenly erupted in the formation. Vrasiu pulled into a high-side gun pass, approaching from above and to the side, rolling inverted to keep the target in sight, pulling through to bring his guns to bear. This was a deflection shot, the target moving perpendicular to his line of fire. The calculations required were complex: target speed, wind, your own speed, bullet drop over distance, time of flight. The Navy taught a formula: range divided by airspeed, multiplied by angular velocity, adjusted for altitude. Vrasiu didn't calculate anything. He just moved the nose of his aircraft to a point in empty space and fired. 3-second burst. The Val's right wing separated from the fuselage at the root. The bomber rolled violently, broke apart, and tumbled toward the sea. By this point, the Japanese formation had reacted. The Vals were scattering, diving for the relative safety of lower altitude. The Zeros were rolling in to engage, and the other American pilots were screaming on the radio, "Where's Brewer 2? Did he get hit? I've lost sight of." Brewer's voice cut through. "2, if you can hear me, climb back to altitude and rejoin." But Vrasiu was already committed to a third attack. A Zero fighter had spotted him. The Japanese pilot was good. He'd recognized the threat and was pulling into a head-on attack. The Zero's nose lit up as its 20mm cannons opened fire. This was the scenario every Navy pilot was trained to avoid. Head-on engagements were suicidal. The closure rate between two aircraft flying toward each other at 300 knots was 900 feet per second. The window for effective fire was perhaps 1 second. Miss, and you had maybe 2 seconds to avoid a mid-air collision. The doctrine was explicit. Never take a head-on shot. Break away. Use your speed to extend. Vrasiu flew straight at the Zero and fired. The combined closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. The Zero's cannon shells traced past Vrasiu's canopy. He could see them, white-orange streaks close enough to make his vision blur. His own .50 caliber rounds walked up the Zero's engine cowling and into the propeller hub. The Zero's propeller disintegrated. Pieces of blade spun away like shrapnel. The fighter nosed down violently as its engine seized, and Vrasiu pulled up and rolled, feeling the Zero pass beneath him so close he could have counted the rivets on its wings. 3 kills. He'd been in combat for approximately 4 minutes. His ammunition counter showed he'd already expended over 800 rounds, 1/3 of his total load. At this rate, he'd be Winchester out of ammunition in 8 more minutes. The training is said to conserve ammunition, to make every burst count. Vrasiu was hunting, and hunters don't stop until the prey is gone or the ammunition runs out. The combat had spread across 20 miles of ocean and 10,000 feet of altitude. The American formation had completely broken down. Pilots were engaged in individual dogfights, trying to apply their training while Japanese fighters tried to kill them. Vrasiu, it was alone in a section of sky that had suddenly emptied. The other aircraft had moved away, chasing or being chased. Below him, at about 12,000 feet, he spotted a Val dive bomber running for home. Smart pilot. Knew his formation was destroyed. I was trying to survive. Vratsiu rolled inverted and pulled into a split S, a diving reversal that traded altitude for speed. The G-forces were crushing. His vision greyed at the edges. The Hellcat accelerated through 400 knots faster than the Navy recommended outside of emergency situations. The Val pilot saw him coming and pushed into a dive, heading for the deck. Also smart. The closer to the ocean, the less maneuvering room an attacker had. They descended through 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. At 4,000 feet, Val leveled off and began jinking random turns left and right to spoil Vratsiu's aim. The bomber was doing perhaps 220 knots. Vratsiu was doing 400. He was closing too, fast. He pulled the throttle back and extended his dive brakes. The manual said dive brakes were only for bombing runs, not for air-to-air combat. His speed bled off to 300 knots. Better. 3,000 feet altitude. The ocean below was close enough that Vratsiu could see individual whitecaps. He pulled lead and fired a 4-second burst. The tracers curved through the air in a lazy arc at this range, nearly 600 feet. Bullet drop was significant. The stream of fire walked up the Val's tail, across the fuselage, and into the cockpit area. The bomber rolled right, hit the water at 200 knots, and cartwheeled across the surface in an explosion of white foam and debris. 4 kills. Vratsiu pulled up hard, climbing away from the ocean. His altitude was 800 feet. The Navy's minimum safe altitude for combat operations was 5,000 feet. He'd just violated another rule. The combat had now lasted approximately 9 minutes. Vratsiu's arms ached from the G-forces and the constant control inputs. His ears rang from the gun noise. His oxygen mask smelled like rubber and sweat. He climbed back to 10,000 feet and looked for targets. The sky had largely cleared. The Japanese formation was destroyed, the survivors running for home in all directions. The American fighters were scattered, individual pilots chasing individual targets or reforming with their wingmen. Vratsiu spotted 2 more Vals at 7 o'clock low, about 5 miles away, heading northwest. They were flying close to the water, hoping to escape notice. He turned toward them. His fuel gauge was showing 3/4 full. His ammunition counter showed approximately 1,300 rounds remaining. Enough. He closed on the Vals from behind and above a stern chase, the easiest shot in aerial combat. The bombers were flying straight and level, their pilots probably thinking they'd escaped. At 1,000 feet range, Vratsiu opened fire on the left-hand Val. 2-second burst. The bomber's left-wing fuel tank exploded in an orange-black fireball. The Val nosed down and hit the water. 5 kills. The second Val pilot reacted immediately, pulled into a hard left turn, trying to get perpendicular to Vratsiu's attack. Good instinct. Made the deflection angle harder. But Vratsiu had done this shot twice already in the last 10 minutes. His hands moved automatically, pulling lead, adjusting for the turn, feeling when the angle was right. 3-second burst. The Val shuddered as 50 caliber rounds tore through its engine and cockpit. It rolled inverted and spun into the ocean. 6 kills. Vratsiu's ammunition counter showed approximately 900 rounds remaining. 9 seconds of firing time. He scanned the sky. Empty. The combat had moved away or ended. He was alone at 10,000 feet over empty ocean, with 6 confirmed kills and movement, 11 o'clock low. Another Val, by itself, running for home at wave-top height. Vratsiu didn't hesitate, didn't think about fuel or ammunition, or the fact that he was now over 40 miles from the carrier. He rolled into a diving attack. This last Val pilot was either very experienced or very lucky. As Vrasiu dove, the bomber began violent, evasive maneuvers, hard turns at random intervals, pulling up and pushing down, making himself an impossible target. Vrasiu followed, matching every maneuver, staying in position. They were at 200 feet altitude. One mistake and either aircraft would hit the water. The Val pilot reversed, pulling into a hard right turn. Vrasiu followed. The Val reversed again, hard left. Vrasiu followed. They were dogfighting, a fighter against a bomber. At 200 feet altitude, at 300 knots, this was insane. Vrasiu's ammunition counter showed 600 rounds, 6 seconds of fire time. The Val pilot made his mistake. He pulled into a climbing turn, trying to gain altitude. It gave Vrasiu 3 seconds of predictable flight path. He pulled the nose up, led the target, and pressed the trigger. The guns fired, the tracers reached out, and then click, the guns went silent. Vrasiu had miscounted. He'd been firing longer bursts than he thought. His ammunition counter showed 0, Winchester, but his last burst had been enough. The Val's right wing folded upward at an impossible angle, the structure failing from the 50 caliber impacts. The bomber rolled inverted and hit the ocean in a spray of white water. 7 kills, 15 minutes, 0 ammunition remaining. Vrasiu was 45 miles from the carrier, low on fuel, and completely alone. The flight back to the Intrepid was the longest 20 minutes of Vrasiu's life. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the shakes, a physiological response to extreme stress that every combat pilot experienced. His hands trembled on the stick. His legs felt weak on the rudder pedals. He climbed to 5,000 feet and turned southeast toward where the carrier should be. His radio was full of chatter. Other pilots from VF6 calling out positions, damage reports, fuel states. He didn't transmit, just flew. The Hellcat had taken damage he hadn't noticed during the combat. There were bullet holes in the tail from that head-on pass with the Zero. 3 holes, ragged and ugly. One had clipped a control cable. The rudder felt mushy. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from somewhere. A thin stream of red liquid trailing from the left wing root. Not catastrophic, but not good. And he was nearly out of fuel. The gauge showed 1/8 remaining, maybe 15 minutes of flight time. He spotted the carrier at 12 miles. The beautiful, ugly grey rectangle sitting in the blue Pacific, with its escort destroyers arranged around it like protective wolves. Brewer's voice came over the radio. "All VF6 aircraft, state your condition." One by one, the pilots reported in. Some had battle damage. One was wounded. Most had expended ammunition. All were low on fuel. When it came to Vrasiu's turn, he keyed the mic. Brewer 2, Winchester, low fuel, minor battle damage, request straight-in approach. There was a pause. Then Brewer's voice, carefully controlled. 2, you are cleared for immediate landing. We'll talk later. The landing was ugly. Vrasiu's damaged rudder made the approach unstable. He came in too fast, too high, had to push the throttle forward for a go-around, and barely had enough fuel for a second attempt. The second approach was better. He caught the 3-wire, not the ideal 4-wire, but acceptable. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck, the arresting cable caught, and the aircraft jerked to a stop with enough force to snap Vrasiu's head forward against the gun sight. He shut down the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. The deck crew swarmed the aircraft. The plane captain climbed onto the wing and opened the canopy. "You okay, sir?" Vrasiu unbuckled his harness and tried to stand. His legs didn't work. The plane captain and another sailor had to help him out of the cockpit. As his feet touched the deck, his stomach rebelled. He bent over the side of the carrier and vomited seawater and breakfast and adrenaline into the Pacific Ocean. The plane captain patted his shoulder. "It's okay, sir. Everybody does that for the first time." But it wasn't the first time that made Vrasiu sick. It was the realization of what he'd just done. 7 kills, in 15 minutes, by himself, violating doctrine, breaking formation, taking shots that should have been impossible. And he had no idea how he'd done it. The intelligence debriefing took place in the squadron ready room 2 hours later. All the VF-6 pilots who'd flown the mission were present. Lieutenant Commander Brewer sat at the front with the squadron intelligence officer and the air group commander. The intelligence officer went through each pilot's combat report systematically. Ammunition expended, fuel consumption, tactical observations, confirmed kills. Most pilots reported 1 or 2 kills. Some reported damage to enemy aircraft probables, not confirmed. One pilot reported no contact with the enemy. He'd gotten separated early and spent the mission trying to rejoin his formation. When they got to Vrasiu, the intelligence officer looked at his preliminary report and frowned. "Ensign Vrasiu, you're claiming 7 confirmed kills?" "Yes, sir." "In one mission? Your first combat mission?" "Yes, sir." The intelligence officer looked at Brewer. Brewer's expression was unreadable. "Walk me through it, Ensign." "From the beginning." Vrasiu described the engagement, the break from formation, the attacks on the Vals, the head-on pass with the Zero, the low-altitude chases, all of it. When he finished, there was silence in the ready room. The air group commander spoke first. "Son, do you understand how unlikely this sounds? The highest single mission kill total for any Navy pilot so far in this war is 4. You're claiming 7? "I'm not claiming anything, sir. I'm reporting what happened." "You broke formation," Brewer said quietly. "You attacked alone. You pursued below minimum safe altitude. You took a head-on shot. You expended all your ammunition in 15 minutes. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that every single one of those actions violates tactical doctrine?" "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do them?" Vrasiu thought about how to answer, how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "I saw opportunities, sir. The shots were there. I took them." The air group commander leaned forward. "I'm going to be very clear with you, Ensign. If you're exaggerating your combat report, that's a court-martial offense. If you're fabricating skills, your career is over. Do you want to revise your statement?" Vrasiu met his eyes. "No, sir. 7 confirmed kills. I'll stand by that." The gun camera footage settled it. Every Hellcat had a camera mounted in the wing, synchronized with the guns. When the trigger was pressed, the camera filmed. The footage was grainy, black and white, often obscured by gun smoke. But it was evidence. Vrasiu's gun camera showed all 7 kills, every burst, every impact, every aircraft falling from the sky. The intelligence officer watched the footage 3 times. Then he called in the squadron commander. They watched it together. Then they called in the air group commander. The 4th time through, they started taking notes. Val bomber, deflection shot, engine fire, confirmed destruction. Val bomber, high side pass, structural failure, confirmed destruction. Zero fighter, head-on engagement, propeller destruction, confirmed destruction. Val bomber, stern chase, wing separation, confirmed destruction. Val bomber, low-altitude pursuit, direct hits, confirmed destruction. Val bomber, stern chase, fuel tank explosion, confirmed destruction. Val bomber, low-altitude pursuit, wing failure, confirmed destruction. 7 confirmed kills, 15 minutes and 42 seconds of combat, 2,200 rounds of ammunition expended. The intelligence officer certified the report. 7 confirmed kills. Ensign Alexander Vrasiu, June 16, 1943. It was the highest single mission kill total by any American pilot in the Pacific Theater to that date, and it had been achieved by a pilot on his first combat mission who had violated virtually every tactical principle the Navy taught. Commander Brewer pulled Vrasiu aside after the debriefing. They stood on the Intrepid's flight deck, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The carrier was making 18 knots, heading southeast toward the next operation. The deck crew was repotting aircraft for the morning launch. Brewer didn't speak for a long time. Finally, "You broke formation." "Yes, sir. You attacked alone. You left me without a wingman. You took shots that should have gotten you killed." "Yes, sir. And you got 7 confirmed kills." "Yes, sir." Brewer turned to look at him. "I should write you up. I should recommend disciplinary action. You violated doctrine, you violated orders, you put yourself and potentially other pilots at risk." Vrasiu waited. "But I'm not going to do that," Brewer continued. "You know why?" "No, sir. Because you were right. Everything you did was wrong according to the manual. And everything you did worked. That head-on shot against the zero that should have been suicide. But you timed it perfectly. That low-altitude chase that should have ended with you in the water. But you knew exactly how much altitude you needed. Those deflection shots, those are the hardest shots in aerial combat. You made them look easy." Brewer paused. "You have something, Vrasiu. I don't know what to call it. Natural ability, instinct. Whatever it is, you can't fake it, and you can't teach it. And that creates a problem." "What problem, sir?" "The problem is that I can't tell other pilots to fly like you do. Because if anyone else tried what you did today, they'd be dead. The doctrine exists for a reason. It keeps average pilots alive. But you're not average. And I don't know what the hell to do with that." The news of Vrasiu's 7 kills spread through the carrier like fire. By the next morning, every pilot in the air group knew about it. By the next week, it had reached Pearl Harbor. Within a month, it was in newspapers back home. Navy pilot shoots down 7 Japanese planes in first combat mission. The reaction from the Navy's training establishment was complicated. On one hand, Vrasiu's success was propaganda gold. At a time when Americans were hungry for good news from the Pacific, a story about a young pilot achieving an impossible kill ratio was invaluable. The Navy promoted the story, carefully edited to emphasize courage and skill, while downplaying the part about violating doctrine. On the other hand, Vrasiu's success created a doctrinal problem, because the question that every training officer had to grapple with was, should we teach pilots to fly like Vrasiu? The obvious answer was no. What Vrasiu had done was unrepeatable. Trying to train conventional pilots to break formation and attack alone would result in catastrophic casualties. The doctrine existed to maximize the survival and effectiveness of average pilots. Vrasiu wasn't average, but that raised an uncomfortable question. Were there other pilots like Vrasiu in the training pipeline? Natural talents who were being suppressed by doctrine, and if so, how could the Navy identify them and train them differently without undermining the entire system? The answer the Navy eventually arrived at was, they couldn't. The system was designed for the majority. The exceptional cases, the voracious, the natural-born aces would have to find their own way. The doctrine would remain defensive and conservative, and the truly gifted pilots would learn to recognize when to follow it and when to abandon it. It was an unsatisfying compromise, but it was the only one that made sense. Alexander Vrasiu flew combat missions for the rest of the war. By August of 1945, his official tally stood at 19 confirmed kills, making him the fourth-ranking Navy ace of World War II. But he never again achieved anything close to those first 15 minutes. Not because he'd gotten worse, but because he'd gotten smarter. He learned when to follow doctrine and when to trust his instincts. He learned that survival mattered as much as victory. He learned to balance aggression with caution. He became, in other words, exactly what the Navy wanted. An experienced pilot who could fly aggressively when necessary, but conservatively when possible. But the other pilots who flew with him always knew there was something different about Vrasiu. In his hands, the Hellcat did things it wasn't designed to do. He saw opportunities that shouldn't have existed. He made decisions before situations developed. The Navy promoted him to squadron commander. They made him an instructor. They studied his techniques and tried to incorporate them into training, but they never could bottle what made him exceptional, because some things can't be taught, some abilities are innate, and sometimes the most valuable thing a military organization can do is recognize exceptional talent and then get out of its way. After the war, Vrasiu did something unusual for a top ace. He returned to civilian life. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't go on lecture tours. He became a test pilot, then a bank executive. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and lived quietly in Los Gatos, California. When reporters occasionally tracked him down to ask about June 16, 1943, his answer was always modest. I was lucky. Right place, right time. Plenty of other guys could have done the same thing. But that wasn't true, and on some level, Vrasiu knew it. In 1986, a naval historian conducting research for the official history of VF6 asked him a direct question. Do you think you would have been as successful if you'd followed the training doctrine? Vrasiu thought for a long time before answering. No, he finally said. The training would have kept me alive, but it wouldn't have made me effective. There's a difference, the historian pressed. What's the difference? The training teaches you to be competent, to survive, to achieve modest results consistently. That's valuable. The Navy needed thousands of pilots who could do that. But combat doesn't care about your training. It cares about whether you can see what's happening faster than the other guy and act on it before he does. That's not something you can learn in a classroom. So, it's natural talent? I don't know what it is, Vrasiu said. I just know I could see things. The way aircraft moved, the way formations had gaps, the way energy states created opportunities. It wasn't conscious. I didn't calculate it. I just knew. Here's what the Navy's post-war analysis eventually revealed about aerial combat and pilot performance. The top 10% of pilots were responsible for approximately 60% of all enemy aircraft destroyed. The distribution wasn't linear, it was exponential. A truly exceptional pilot wasn't twice as effective as an average pilot. He was 10 times as effective. But exceptional pilots were also statistically more likely to be killed, because the same aggressive instincts that made them deadly also made them vulnerable. The doctrine that kept average pilots alive didn't apply to them. The Navy's solution was to try to identify these exceptional pilots early in training and give them different instruction, not more aggressive tactics, but more autonomy. Permission to trust their instincts when appropriate. It helped. But it didn't solve the fundamental problem. You can't train someone to be exceptional. You can only train them not to get killed while they figure out how to be exceptional on as their own. Alexander Vrasiu figured it out in 15 minutes over the Solomon Islands. And in doing so, he revealed something uncomfortable about military training, about aerial combat, and about human ability. Sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes doctrine is a limitation rather than a framework. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you've been taught. Vratsiu died on January 29, 2015, at the age of 96. He was the last surviving Navy ace of his caliber from World War II. At his funeral, one of his former squadron mates said something that captured the essential truth of who Vratsiu was. Alex never talked much about those 15 minutes. I think he understood that what happened that day couldn't be explained in a way that made sense. He just saw things the rest of us couldn't see, and when the moment came, he didn't think. He just acted. That's the difference between competence and greatness. The Navy named a building at Naval Air Station Oceana after him. His gun camera footage is shown to trainee pilots as an example of effective deflection shooting. His combat reports are studied in tactical courses, but the real lesson of Alexander Vratsiu isn't in the specific tactics he used. It's in the recognition that some abilities are innate, that doctrine exists to maximize average performance, but can suppress exceptional performance, and that sometimes the most valuable thing a system can do is recognize when to step aside. 7 Japanese aircraft, 15 minutes. One pilot who cheated on his eye exam and violated every rule he'd been taught. And a truth about war that the Pentagon has never been comfortable acknowledging. Natural talent matters more than training. Instinct matters more than doctrine. And sometimes, breaking the rules is exactly what the situation requires. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.